Hi, everybody. Today's lecture is Honeybee Biology, the Individual Bee. And in this lecture, I'm going to be taking you through the anatomy of the honeybee, both internal and external. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the functionality of caste and how that relates to division of labor within the colony. And then we're going to wrap up today talking a little bit about honeybee vision and how bees actually see the world around them. This is one of those types of lectures that you do need to kind of really pay attention to a couple of really key areas. And the real key area that I really want you to spend some time in memorizing is the life cycles of each of the castes of honeybees. And we're going to talk about that in this lecture. So let's start with a little bit about our Western honeybee, also known as the European honeybee, Apis mellifera. Apis mellifera is the species of honeybee that we keep in the United States. There are many subspecies of Apis mellifera, and that kind of goes along with more regional species. So you tend to see there's some variety amongst the species of Apis mellifera, and we call those subspecies. And you'll know those essentially kind of in the common language as like Russian bees will be a subspecies. The Africanized honeybee is a subspecies. So there's all of these different subspecies within Apis mellifera. But Apis mellifera is the honeybee, and it is a honey-producing bee, no matter what the subspecies is. So the neat thing about honeybees is that they're very unique as far as insects go. There are not many insects that we manage, and European honeybees or honeybees are really one of the only that are managed as livestock by humans. There's several other species in the Apis genus that are also managed in other parts of the world, but Apis mellifera is definitely the most widely distributed of the honey-producing bees that are kept by humans. And humans are responsible pretty much for the proliferation of this species. We have moved it pretty much everywhere that Europeans and Asiatic cultures have kind of moved around the world. This honeybee has come with them. And the reason that it has proliferated so well is that when it gets into these environments that are not its native range, it has this really amazing ability to adapt. And honeybees are excellent at adapting to situations, both environmental and then, kind of situational stressors like pathogens and things like that. There are some things that are much more difficult for honeybees to deal with, mainly because they are not co-evolved with certain things. So when you're co-evolved with something, it means that it's been an arms race since like the beginning of time. Your species may have a mutation at some point that gives you a little bit of an advantage over another species that may be attacking you, and it goes back and forth over a very long period of time. This is evolution of a species, is this kind of arms race that we go through as organisms on our planet as we go through time. The one thing that is kind of important to note, and I'll talk about this all the time through this course, is that we are dealing with a parasitic mite called the Varroa mite that is it's a species that the Apis mellifera it has not co-evolved with, and in fact has only been interacting with this species for a matter of decades. We think around the 1940s is really when European honeybees, Western honeybees, got into a position where they were brought into Southeast Asia, where the native range of Varroa mite is, and essentially it jumped species from one species of Apis cerana, to Apis mellifera. And Apis mellifera, because it's not co-evolved, has no defenses against Varroa mite. And the only reason I bring up Varroa mite right here is because for those of you that maybe have a little bit of experience with honeybees, there's a Varroa mite in this picture. Oftentimes I hear people tell me, oh, I never saw Varroa mite, so I don't have them. Well, the reason you don't see them is because this brown spot that's tucked underneath this segment is a Varroa mite. And this is where Varroa mites tend to hang out on bees as they're feeding on them. So I just wanted to point that out real quick, that is actually part of this picture, and it'll come up later on when we start talking a little bit about some of the internal organs that Varroa mite attacks. All right, so let's jump into some of the basic anatomy of the honeybee. All right, so with any insect, you have a division of body parts within the insect. And where we have in all insects is that we have a head, and the head is usually a kind of center of sensory organs. So you have things like antennae, your eyes on the head. Then you have a thorax, which is the middle portion of the body. The thorax is basically the area of locomotion. So all muscles are contained in that thorax. It's a very, very beefy part of the bee. When you're handling queens, you want to handle them by the thorax because it's the strongest part of the body. It's also where your legs are all located at. So all three pairs of legs come from the thorax, and both of your wings come from the thorax. So it is the true center of locomotion. And then we have the abdomen, and the abdomen is basically where all of your digestive parts are. A lot of glands in the abdomen. Your venom sac is in there, and your stinger. So all of these other parts that are really important functionally for a honeybee. A lot of the digestive system is in this area, is located in the abdomen, and the abdomen has these segments that you can see on them. So they're broken up, and those segments, the way that that's broken up allows for that abdomen to shrink and swell very readily. So it's very kind of moldable, let's say, based on the condition. So like if you're a forager and you went out and you collected a ton of honey and it's in your honey stomach, that abdomen's going to actually elongate. And when you start to get to know bees a little bit better, you can actually sit at the front of a hive and tell that there's a honey flow going on just by seeing these fat abdomens starting to come in from the field. So it is something that you can readily observe. And so that's the basic body plan of a honeybee as far as how it's divided. So let's kind of point out some of the important parts. I'm not going to go through everything, but we're going to touch on the things that are important for you to know as a beginner, as a beginning beekeeper. The first piece that I want to point out is the antennae. So the antenna of all insects are basically kind of like, you can think of it like your fingers with a nose at the end of your finger. So they use it for touch, they use it for smell, and basically what the antennae have on them are these individual segments. So honeybees have 12 segments in their antenna, and on those segments are these receptors, these odor receptors. We call them chemoreceptors. And essentially, they're receptors that allow bees to interpret the smells out in the landscape. Now, insects and plants, and this may blow your mind a little bit, but this is my area of expertise and what I did my PhD on, but insects and plants communicate with one another. They're talking to each other, and they talk to each other not through language like we talk. They talk to each other through volatile chemicals, so smells. And by volatile chemicals, those are chemicals that are floating around in the air and are odors, essentially. And some of them, we can perceive some odors, but many of them we cannot. But bees have 170 odor receptors on these antennae that allow them to interpret the environment around them. It allows them to talk to other bees. It allows them to smell things in the landscape, to be able to determine where food resources are, things like that. And so these are very important parts of the honeybee. If you take these off, bees are lost. So they're very important organs and really how they're interpreting a lot of the world around them. The next thing that we're going to point out on the head is the compound eye. The compound eye is a very important part of honeybees because it allows them to see the world. So they are interpreting smell and touch a lot of the time through the antennae, and then we're seeing the world through our eyes. Now, the number of facets on these compound eyes vary based on the caste that you belong to. So queens have about 4,500 facets on their eyes. Workers have somewhere around 5,400 facets is the most recent research. And drones, you're looking at around 10,000 facets on them. Now, when we get to the actual anatomy of these three castes and how they're slightly different from one another, I'm going to point out to you why this is the way it is. It may seem a little weird that our queen has the least amount of facets and our drone has the most, but what I want to impress upon you is that the eyes of drones are very big, and they're very big for a specific reason, and that's because they mate with queens in flight, and they have to be able to see almost 360 degrees where the queens are. So that's why they have more facets. Now, also on the compound eye, and you can see in this close-up picture here, there's a lot of hairs on compound eye. But when you look at the bee overall, bees are very hairy. They're hairy organisms. As bees age, you will actually see them lose hair. The back of the thorax where it's very hairy on this bee. This is a young bee. And the way I can tell is because, one, it's very furry, and two, the margins of the wings back here are completely smooth. When they get old, they're very tattered because they're flying all the time. So this is a young bee. And what you can see is that this young bee has hair everywhere, not just on the eyes. But essentially why bees are furry is for pollen collection. So when bees go into a flower, they're going for the nectaries, and pollen is more of a kind of an after effect of collecting nectar. And what I mean by that is that pollen is negatively charged. So flowers have a negative charge to them. And so pollen has a negative charge as well. Honeybees, they're furry, they're flying through the air, and they are positively charged as they're flowing through the air. They are a positively charged organism. And basically, when they come into contact with pollen, when it gets close to them, it's like a magnet. They just attach to them. And so when bees come out of a flower, they're covered in pollen. And that is one of the reasons for the eyes to be covered with those hairs, is so that pollen, when it gets on there, it can be groomed off and then put into the pollen baskets. Additionally, when you're flying through the air, if there's debris in the air and things like that, these also protect the eye so that things aren't hitting the eye directly. So they're also allowing for some protection there as well. But that's why bees are furry. They're furry because that's how they collect pollen. And like I said, it's a negative and positive charge coming together, and it just pollen basically just sticks to them as they get close to those anthers on the flowers. They just sticks to them. All right, the next thing that we see on the head is right above the compound eye, on the top of the head, we have three simple eyes called ocelli. Now, ocelli are something that we see on a lot of insects, and basically what they are is they're like a rudimentary eye that's used to basically orient to the sun. So when it's cloudy outside, they can determine where the location is of the sun based on the ocelli. So the ocellis are basically utilized to kind of orient in the landscape, but they're not used for vision. They're like the compound eye. They are very simple, and it's mainly, I usually tell people, you can kind of think about it as like a light sensor, a sun sensor on your car. You know, it's something that's like right on the dash and allows the car to know if it's dark outside or not. It turns your headlights on or turns them off. It's kind of that same thing. It's just determining kind of light concentration and location of the sun. It helps them with that. All right, now we're moving to the thorax. And the first thing that we're going to look at on the top of the thorax is the wings. Now, bees have two pairs of wings. And one of the things that I love as an entomologist is you see all these people and it's mostly marketing companies that will do things about like raising money for bees. And they'll have this lovely video with humans and, all this great language about honeybees. And then all of a sudden you see a picture of an insect and it looks like a honeybee, but in actuality, it's a fly. So there is a lot of mimics, we call them, of honeybees. Because honeybees are venomous insects, there's been evolution over time with other insects and they basically kind of taken on the colors of bees, and they're warning colors. So it's the typical like black and yellow color that you see on bees, you'll see on these flies. And most of these flies are called syrphid flies. And what the hilarious thing is that you can tell one between the other. Well, when you get to know bees, they don't look like bees whatsoever. They have huge eyes covering their entire head, maybe a drone you might mistake them for. But the big distinguishing factor is that flies always have one pair of wings. They don't have two pairs of wings. So if you see an insect that has one pair of wings on it, it's a fly. It's not a bee. Flies they belong to the order Diptera, and those all are going to have one pair of wings, whereas bees belong to the order Hymenoptera. Hymenoptera always have two pairs of wings when they're winged. We do have ants that belong to the Hymenoptera family that are wingless, but for the most part, we're talking about two pairs of wings. And those wings are divided up. The one that's closest to the head is called the forewing. The small ones that are towards the back are called the hind wings. The way that bees produce lift and really are able to kind of produce enough lift to get off the ground is that they connect the two wings together. So the forewing and the hind wing, when they're producing lift, connect to produce more surface area to get up and to move quicker. The way that this is done is through this little kind of, it's almost like Velcro called the hamuli. The hamuli is basically this row of hooks on the front of the hind wing, and they latch into a groove that's on the back of the forewing. And so what they do, they connect together kind of like Velcro would, and that's how they connect and produce lift. So that's a little bit about the wings. The next thing I want to point out on the exterior of the body is the spiracles. So now we're on to the abdomen here. The spiracles are basically the way that it's the way that bees allow air to enter their body. So we breathe through our mouths and our nose. Bees breathe through their spiracles. And there are 10 pairs of spiracles on the, between the abdomen and the thorax. The thorax has 3 pairs that are at the back, and the abdomen has 7 pairs that cover all the segments of the abdomen. Now, it's difficult to see on adult bees, but this is where, let me get my cursor over here. This is where they're located, is right down here. Now, when you see larvae, you can, especially mature larvae where they're almost ready to be capped, you can see them very clearly. They're black dots that are down the side of the larva. So these are something that are with the bees from the beginning. The spiracles, they're basically openings that open and close that allow air to come in and out, and they're attached to trachea, and the trachea are then attached to air sacs. And I'm going to show you that when we get into the inside anatomy of the bee. All right, back to the thorax. The front leg, the foreleg. The foreleg is really, legs obviously are used for walking. But the real functionality of the foreleg is it has an antenna cleaner on it. So the legs are used for grooming a lot, and bees will constantly be grooming themselves, both to move pollen around that's attached to the hairs, but also to clean themselves. So the antennae get dirty over time, and there's a little spot in the crux of that arm right there, that leg right there, right around here, that actually has a little cutout in it that's perfectly shaped to the antennae. And it's an antenna cleaner. And they literally will take their arm or their leg, their foreleg, and wipe it down the antennae to clean the antennae off. The next leg is the midleg. The midleg is mainly used for grooming and then also passing pollen back and forth. So as pollen's being collected by the forelegs, it's passed to the midlegs and then to the hind legs, where the pollen baskets reside. And that is what's the main functionality of the hind leg, is it's got a pollen basket. It's also where pollen is packed on and compressed. So you have your pollen basket, which is located right here on that hind leg. As far as mouth parts are concerned, bees there are several insects that have this, but many insects that don't, which is 2 pairs of mouth or 2 types of mouth parts. So the mouth parts are located at the front of the bee. The first one I want to point out is the mandibles. So bees have both mandibles, which are I'm pointing to my screen. You can't see my screen, but let's see. The mandibles right here are on this outside portion of this straw-like thing that's coming out of its mouth. You can also see it right here. So the mandibles are used for things like manipulating wax. They're used for things like chewing your way out of your cell when you're born, but essentially they're used for chewing is what they're used for. So how they manipulate pollen is with the mandibles as well. And the other thing that you see on here is that straw-like organism or organ that is called the proboscis. And the proboscis, you can basically think of it as a straw. It's what they use to collect nectar and water with. Is basically they dip it down in there and they suck up through that straw-like mouth part. So the reason I say this is a little unique, it's not rare, but it's a little unique. If you think of some other insects like, say, praying mantis, those individuals only have mandibles. They don't have a proboscis because they're mainly chewing things as the way that they eat, whereas honeybees are both chewing and sucking nectar as well. All right, let's move to the internal organs. Now, I do want to say we're not going to cover everything, just like we didn't cover all the things out on the outside of the bee. We covered most of the big parts, but this is a basic introduction to this. We can get a lot deeper. But I want you to all kind of know some of the basic internal organs of the honeybee. Now, what you see first is the central nervous system. So bees have a central nervous system, and it's comprised of a brain that's in the head that is connected to a central nerve core, which goes all the way to the back of the abdomen. Now, along this nerve cord are what we call ganglia, and that's these dark blue dots that you see here. Some of them have arrows pointed to them, but you can see these ganglia go all the way down the nerve cord. That is kind of your nerve centers. So the brain is connected to this nerve cord that's also connected to these nerve centers comprised of ganglia, and that's essentially the nervous system of a honeybee. Is that system right there? It's a basic system. Most insects have this same kind of setup. Is all that I can think of right now, have this same setup with these ganglia serving as basically these nerve centers throughout the body. All right, the circulatory system. The circulatory system is basically made up of the heart and the aorta, and it's an open system. So honeybees do not have veins like we do that have blood coursing through them. Their whole inside is bathed in hemolymph, which is essentially bee blood. It's insect blood. But hemolymph, instead of being in a system like ours, where it's in literally a system of veins, it basically just sits kind of in this whole area of the bee. Now, the way that this kind of works is that in order to get like circulation of hemolymph going, the heart's working in tandem with these muscle cells that are in here, and they create circulation in the hemolymph basically through this kind of pumping action, this rhythmic pumping action that basically kind of moves the hemolymph through the body, and it moves from the back of the bee to the front of the bee and then back again. So it's constantly moving, but it's not like how our blood moves through these veins. It's basically like the organs are bathed in it, and it's just kind of being pushed back and forth through this circulatory system. The respiratory system. So instead of lungs, bees have these thin-walled air sacs, and they're placed along these trachea in the body. Now, we talked about spiracles to start with. Now, these little lines you see here are trachea. Those trachea are connected to the spiracle. So the spiracle is the outside portion of the respiratory system. It opens up and closes based on the needs of the bee as it's breathing. As they open up, the air comes into the trachea, and then air is moved through the trachea into these tracheal air sacs. And basically, it's a very kind of rudimentary system. And how it's kind of moving is that this basically works, and you can see this happening with bees, is that air is sucked into these spiracles by that abdomen really moving at a very rapid pace based on the needs of the bee. So if it's a really hot day and you have a forager that's come in from foraging, you'll see their abdomen moving very rapidly, and that is them breathing, and it's through contraction that those spiracles are opening, letting air in and closing, and then it's being moved through those trachea to these air sacs within the body. The digestive system. So the digestive system is very, very cool in my opinion of honeybees, but no, I'm an entomologist. I love everything insect. But one of the cool things about it is that they have a honey stomach. Okay, so I'm going to kind of go through, basically we're going to go from the front to the back, okay? So where we're going to start is the mouth. So the mouth is where food is coming in. It's attached to the esophagus. The esophagus is then attached to the honey stomach, also known as the crop. Now, this is one of the cool things about bees. Foragers, when they're collecting nectar, they're putting nectar into their honey stomach. Now, I've heard people, and you've probably heard it too, or maybe you even thought this at one point, that honey is bee vomit. I hear this, every once in a while, someone will say this at a talk I'm giving, or I'll see it on the internet, that people are saying that, that honey is just bee vomit, and it's not. The thing is that the honey stomach is a storage organ. It is not connected to the rest of the digestive system. So We went from the esophagus to the honey stomach. If a bee is collecting nectar in the landscape, that's where that stops. And then when the bee, the forager, comes back to the nest, it will pass that content of the honey stomach off to a house bee who will then move it into where it needs to go in the colony. So the honey stomach, because it's not attached to the digestive system, it literally is just like a storage vessel. It's like if you or I were to put honey in a jar and carry it and pass it off to somebody else. So it's not bee vomit. Now, the reason for that is, the reason that this whole area is sequestered from the rest of the digestive system is because of one special thing, and that's the proventriculus. This black line that you see here is essentially a one-way check valve. When things go through the proventriculus, they don't come back out. And so that is really where digestion starts, is once we get past the proventriculus, which is a one-way check valve. It keeps the honey stomach away from the digestive system. So you don't have digestive enzymes creeping into your honey, okay? The next piece that we have is the ventriculus, and it's this whole big thing you see kind of right here, that big organ that we see right there, also known as the midgut. The ventriculus is basically where it's basically the true digestive center of the stomach. It's where it's kind of like akin to our stomach, essentially. And that's a big organ full of enzymes. Things are being digested. But like I said, the big thing to note is that this is distinctly separate from the honey stomach by the proventriculus. Okay, as we continue back down the digestive system, you can see as we get close to the ileum, we have these they're blue lines that are coming out of that area. That's my drawing. So, you can only do so much with PowerPoint. But those are known as Malpighian tubules. Malpighian tubules are essentially kind of like our kidneys. So they detoxify things. So they're basically cleaning up and filtering waste out of the digestive system, but they also filter waste out of the hemolymph as well. So they're doing both duties, and just kind of like our kidneys, they're removing things that are going to be that are waste products from our body. The next thing is the ileum. The ileum is essentially like a small intestine. So when you're thinking about how this is laid out, you have those Malpighian tubules, which are removing the waste. The ileum is removing the nutrients from the digested food that we have in the digestive tract. And then the last thing that we have here is our rectum, which is then connected to the anus. There's your basic digestive system of a honeybee. It's not a super complicated system, but it is something, that's a little different than what we are typically used to with vertebrate animals or even ourselves. All right. The next thing I want to point out that's in this internal, that is part of the internal organs of the honeybee, is the fat bodies. Now you can see that I've got the whole kind of abdomen marked as fat bodies, and fat bodies really are throughout the body. So they're not. And that's why there's no one fat body on there, but they're primarily concentrated on the lower portion of the abdomen. And there's been a lot of research into fat bodies recently. And the reason is because fat bodies are responsible for several very important things. And we're going to really dive into them when we do the varroa mite lecture. But really the main things that you need to keep in mind is that they do a ton of stuff. They're very important. The fat body is very important to the organism at large. One, it also acts kind of like a liver. And so it is removing things like pesticides, all sorts of environmental contaminants. This is how that's cleaned up in a bee's body, is through the fat body. It's also an area that processes fats and helps store fats. It's a place for energy reserves. And it also is a really key component of metabolism in the bee itself, and of all sorts of other things, again, that we're going to talk about. But the big thing here is it is a very important organ, and it is really the key component to surviving winter. The ability for bees to store fat and be able to produce vitellogenin, which we're going to talk about a little later, but the ability to store fat is a key survival trait of winter bees. Think of it like a big bear. A bear has got to eat a lot of stuff to be able to survive hibernating winter. Now, bees aren't hibernating during the winter. They're still active, but they have to have fat stores to get through. Now, you see this picture on the left. I'm going to go one more slide in, and we're going to see that varroa mite again. That is where the varroa mite is located, is where it's feeding on the fat body. So this is where bees are damaged by varroa mite physically. This is where varroa mite feeds. And there's research out here that shows that it's, and I don't remember the exact number, but it's like 90% of the time when they're feeding, they're on that bottom portion of the abdomen, right in this location. So that is where the mites are feeding at. And what they're feeding on is the fat body in that location. And what you can see over here is this is what happens when a bee is fed upon by a varroa mite and it impacts its fat body. The one on the left, this is a winter bee. The one on the left has a damaged fat body. And you can see, this is the abdomen. You can see that abdomen is pretty much void of all those fat deposits, the white stuff that you see in the picture on the right. The picture on the right is a healthy bee, and there are fat deposits everywhere in that abdomen. That is how your bee is going to survive the winter. So when I am continuing to harp on varroa mite management and monitoring, this is why it's so important in northern climates. We have such a long winter. If your fat body is compromised, your bees have no chance. If you're in a more temperate climate where you have a month of winter, you might be able to recover because your winter bees don't last that long. Our winter bees live for 4 to 6 months. They have to be healthy and they've got to be fat. It's the only way to get through the winter up here. So this is why varroa mite colonies will die generally before the first of the year up here in the Upper Peninsula in northern Michigan. So if you go into winter with what you think is a healthy colony and might be completely infected by varroa mite, your bees literally have no capacity to put on fat stores. And so they die very quickly in the winter. And so that's why I say to most folks, if you have bees that have died before January 1st, 99% of the time, it is varroa mite because of this specifically that I'm talking about right now. Knowing the biology of these organisms is really important in understanding how things like varroa mites are actually affecting bees. Because of a lot of the stuff that you hear from folks who are not professional beekeepers, don't come from academia, a lot of the stuff that is talked about with varroa mite is steeped in the misunderstanding of the actual bee, its biology, and the biology of the varroa mite. So those are a couple key things that you really need to keep in mind, is that management and what I'm going to be teaching you this year is based on science. It's not based on things that just people believe. I am not going to show you anything that is not backed up by research. And that's really important to be successful at beekeeping, because there's a lot of nonsense out there in the beekeeping communities, especially around how we treat and manage varroa mites. All right, the flight muscles. Now we're into the thorax again. You can see this is a huge area. The flight muscles are, I mean, they occupy most of the thorax, or the muscles that comprise that. And you can see on this animation on the left, this is kind of how they work. So they contract, and they contract them and stretch them, contract them and stretch them. And that's how they move. And you can actually see this in the thorax. You can actually see them moving. There is some flexibility to the thorax as well, that you can actually witness this on, well, you know, it's usually on like high-speed cameras and things like that. You'd be able to see that. The venom sac, that's the business end of the bee, right? The venom sac is located at the end of the bee. And you can see in this picture right here that, when bees sting humans, that venom sac comes out, a lot of the guts come out with it as well, when you're stung by a bee as a human. Now, the thing is that bees their stingers do not come out when they sting other organisms. So, for example, other insects. When they sting another insect to defend the colony or something like that, they don't lose their stinger. So, like if you have a robber trying to get into the entrance of a beehive and you have your guards that are standing guard, they may sting that individual to get them out of the beehive, but they're not dying every time they sting them. They can retract that. The problem with it for humans and for other vertebrates is that because of the density of our skin, the stinger is barbed, and when it goes into the skin, it gets stuck, and that's why all of that comes out with it. Now, the thing about getting stung by a honeybee, if you get stung, you want to get the stinger out as quickly as possible, unless you're doing it for some other reason, which apitherapy is something that my wife and I practice, where we sting ourselves intentionally. You leave the stinger in when you're doing that kind of work, mainly for arthritis is what we use it for. But when you're getting stung, maybe like when you're working in a bee yard or something like that, you want to get this out immediately. And the reason is because the venom sac will continue. There's a muscle in there that's independent of the bee. And when it comes out, that muscle continues to pump. And so as long as that stinger's in you, it's going to continue delivering venom into you. So if you get stung outside, generally what I say is, take your fingernails and just pull it out. There's no big deal about it. You just, or easier is just to scrape it out with your fingernail rather than trying to pull it out. So something to note, but that is the business end of the bee, is the venom sac, and it also has a gland associated with it, the venom gland. All right, so that leads us into glands. Now, there are lots of glands out there in honeybees, and I'm only going to talk about 3 of them because I just want to keep this simple. This is one of the longer, more content-filled lectures that you're going to have. Next would be the pests and pathogens lecture. And, this is content you really need to know, but I don't want to overwhelm you. And there's a lot of glandular function in bees. So I'm going to talk about these 3, the hypopharyngeal gland, the salivary gland, and the wax glands. All right, so the hypopharyngeal gland, this is a gland that's located in the head. The gland itself, it changes function not only over the age of workers, but it can change function based on the needs of the colony. So say the food presence, whether there's lots of pollen coming in, lots of nectar coming in, it can change then. It can also change based on the presence of larvae as well. So the glands themselves are most active in young bees. However, they can also be developed in old workers if young bees are absent. So if you are an old worker, say you've been a forager for a while and there's a shortage of young bees, you can actually revert back to that functionality as a house bee, and your hypopharyngeal gland will change what it's doing. It will, and the reason is because the workers themselves, when they're in contact with brood, that is when this gland is most active. And the reason it's most active is because it's one of the really important components of royal jelly production. So it's a gland that's rich in proteins, and the secretion that comes from this gland is a really important component of that royal jelly. So that's one function of it. So hyperpharyngeal glands are also less active when bees are compromised by varroa mite. So this is also another thing that happens with them, is that if you get into situations where you have high varroa mite levels that are affecting the bee, it can also affect the glandular function of the hyperpharyngeal gland. And what happens when you can't create the components of royal jelly is that your young bees starve. So this is really important to understand. The other thing that goes along with the hypopharyngeal gland is that later in life, it is actually used to produce enzymes that break down nectar into honey. So it not only is functional for royal jelly production, also works later on in life for the utilization of enzyme production for honey development. So when honey comes in, it's a complex sugar, and it's broken down into a simple sugar, 2 simple sugars. So it comes in as sucrose and is broken down into glucose and fructose through enzymatic action. Some of those enzymes produced by the hypopharyngeal gland. The next glandular system is the salivary gland. So we have 2 glands that are associated with that. We have a head salivary gland and the thoracic salivary gland. The glands, they're connected by a common duct at the base of the labium, which is a component of the head. And those glands, they're really well developed in workers. They're really well developed in queens, and in drones, they're very small. So they also, as over the casts that we have of bees, these glands actually are very different. So in your queens and your workers, you have them, but in the drones, they're very small and undeveloped. The salivary glands are most active in bees and workers when they are foraging. Part of that is that they also produce enzymes that help break down the nectar into simple sugars. The other thing that they can do is there are secretions that come from this that are also components of royal jelly, and there's also they're also used to the products that come from the salivary gland are also used in molding wax as well. So being able to soften that wax up so that it's moldable. So very important multifunctional gland, and these are two of the most important glands in honeybees. The next one that I want to point out is back here on the abdomen. You can see these 4 pairs of glands here. These are wax glands. Bees produce wax by themselves. So this is like us producing 2x4s to build our own house. Bees produce them on the bottom of the abdomen, and they collect those wax sheets that they produce. And that's how they build combs, is with that. Now, very young or old bees do not secrete wax. Bees that are 12 to 16 days old are the ones that have greatest wax production. So it's only kind of a narrow period where workers are really producing a lot of wax. It's a very resource intensive process, which is why bees are not producing wax throughout their lives, because those resources need to be allocated for other things. All right, now we're going to jump into bee casts. So we got through all the anatomy. I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you do a little time studying that a little bit, especially the exterior portions of the honeybee. Very important to understand. All right, let's get into bee casts. So we have 3 castes of bees in our beehives. We have workers, we have queen, and we have drones. Now, the way that this is divided up by sex, workers and queens are females. Males are drones. And when we look at them morphologically, you can see these are very different looking bees when you put them next to each other. However, when you have a colony full of 60,000, sometimes they can look a little bit alike. I know that a lot of us will get overwhelmed when you see just a huge frame full of bees. There's just bees running everywhere. But these are very easy to distinguish. And I'm going to give you a few key characteristics to see visually that you can use to tell the difference between them. Okay, let's start with the queen. The queen is the biggest in the colony. Her abdomen is always going to be very extended unless she is a virgin, in which case her abdomen is small. The reason for that is that she needs to have a small abdomen to be able to fly. Your queens, when they're gravid, when they're big and laying, they cannot fly very well. So when you're inspecting a colony, if your queen falls out of your colony onto the ground, she will not make it back. If for some reason you're messing with her and she flies off, she'll fly for maybe 10, 20 feet, but she's going to land somewhere and never get off the ground again. So you have to understand that queen handling and hive handling, which we have a whole lecture on, is a very important part of maintaining healthy queens. Crushing queens, rolling queens, dropping queens, stepping on queens because you dropped them. All of these things are going to be really detrimental to your colony. It's very hard to make up time when you lose a queen because it takes about 4 weeks to get a queen from egg to mated and laying. And so that's something to keep in mind. But she's the biggest one in the colony, and there's going to be one of her in the colony. Now, the other thing is that you can see when we compare her to a female, the head and thorax look very similar in these two. But the one thing you will note on queens is generally the back of the thorax, it has very little fur compared to a younger bee, which has a lot of fur. So it is a little bit of a characteristic that you can look at that can tell you if it's a queen or not, but the abdomen is going to be the teller. Also, the way she walks is it's a little bit different than the rest of the bees walk. And so just paying attention to when you see her, how she's moving and observing that can also be helpful in trying to identify her when you see her. When you look at her compared to a drone, they look night and day different. The drone compared to the worker and the queen. The drone is a very big, beefy bee. Its thorax is very big. Its abdomen is very stout, and its head is huge. And the big characteristic that you can tell right away is look at the eyes. The eyes of the worker, remember we talked about the number of facets on these? And workers and queens are under, they're around like 5,000 facets, where that drone has twice as many, basically. The eyes of the drone can cover the entire head for the most part. When you see the eye on the worker and the queen, those are isolated to the sides of the head. So just by looking at the face, you can tell this is a drone. The other thing you can tell is that big, beefy thorax is way bigger than the worker or the queen. And when you look at the abdomen, the big difference is when you look at a queen and you look at a worker, the abdomen comes to a tip. Now, the reason it comes to a tip is because they both have stingers. Now, a queen will not sting you. They use stingers to kill other queens, but workers will sting us. But they both have stingers, and so that abdomen comes to a taper at the back end of it where the stinger's at. Drones do not have stingers. They have penises, also known as an ediagus. The ediagus is their sexual organ, and drones mate in flight. So you have a queen flying through the air, a drone grabs onto her back end, uses his ediagus to fertilize her, and then falls off and dies. That's the life of a drone. But because they have an ediagus and not a stinger, you can see the back end is pretty flat, and it's always going to be very furry. So that's another key characteristic that you can see the difference between these casts when you're looking at them. As far as the life cycle, the total time it takes for a bee to start at an egg and finish as an adult bee. This is not the length of time they live. This is the life cycle to go from an egg to an adult. For a worker, 21-day life cycle. That's how long it takes to go from an egg to an adult. Overall lifespan, 45 to 60 days during the season. Winter worker bees or winter bees, 4 to 6 months is how long they'll live. Queen bees, 16-day life cycle. So from egg to adult queen, 16 days. At that point, she is not mated, though. And usually it takes about another week for her to get mated, and then she'll come back and we'll start laying eggs at that point. So total cycle to get a mated queen is it's usually about 4 weeks is how long it takes for a queen to go from egg to actually laying in your hive, even though her life cycle is 16 days to turn into an adult. The next one is drones, and drones have a 24-day life cycle. Now, drones are going to not be very long-lived. They're, same kind of thing, 45 to 60 days. I should have said queens can live for years. They tend to be productive 1 to 2 years, but they can live for years. As far as drones, short life cycle as well, 45 to 60 days. And one thing that's a caveat about drones is they don't make it through the winter. They get kicked out in the fall because they don't do anything for the colony. They are basically not collecting food. They just mate, and that's it. So they don't stay in the colony over winter because they're just a suck on resources. All right, the stages of growth when we're looking about this life cycle we talked about. Okay, so let's start with queens. You have a 16-day life cycle. The first 3 days are spent as an egg. Then you hatch, and from day 4 through 9, you are a larva. Then on day 10 through 15, you are a pupa. This is a capped stage at this point. So we're open. This is open cell at this point when we're larva because you're being fed by nurse bees. You're being fed royal jelly. You're being fed nectar. You're being fed pollen. You're being fed this rich, milky diet of good stuff to get big fast. So that's day 4 through 9. That's uncapped. When we're in the pupal stage, that's when we're capped. And that's when the bees do this complete metamorphosis where they go from this thing that looks like a worm to an actual bee. And then on day 16, our queen hatches. So that is the life cycle of a queen. Now that's important to know, and I want you to memorize these life cycles because you need to know these, and they're going to come up as you're working bees. The worker, same thing, 3 days in the egg stage, day 4 through 9 in the larval stage. But it spends a little bit longer in the pupal stage. Days 10 through 20 are spent in the pupal stage, and then we hatch on day 21. Drones. Drones are bigger bees. They take a little longer to develop. 3 days in the egg stage, day 4 through 9 in the larval stage, days 10 through 23 in the pupal stage. It's also worth noting, drone cells are bigger than worker cells, so it is a bigger cell for a bigger bee. It takes a little longer to develop. And on day 24, we hatch. When we look at this kind of as a graphic, this is how it happens. Our queen comes through, she lays an egg at the bottom of that cell, and that cell hatches on day 3, after 3 days as a larva. Then we go into day 10, where we're actually starting that first stage of the pupal stage, getting capped, go through our pupal stage, and then come out, chew our way out with those mandibles that we spoke about on day 21. Eggs. I'm going to show you what all this looks like. Eggs, larva, and capped brood. Eggs are very important to be able to see. I know many of us I wear glasses all the time. I know many of us have vision impairments when we're trying to look at things close up. But as a beekeeper, you need to be able to see eggs. You got to just practice until you get it right. The way that you can see eggs is this way. Have the frame in front of you, the sun coming over your back, down into the cells themselves. And you use that sun, you have to adjust to the sun to just get the light right, to get it right down in those cells that you can see eggs. You have to be able to do this. If you need a magnifying glass, if you need a flashlight, just use them. Because this is one of the ways that we determine if we're queen right. I'm going to talk about that in our superorganism lecture, what that actually means. But it means that we have a queen that's present and laying. But essentially, this is what eggs look like. There's one egg per cell in a queen right colony. This is a picture on Wax Foundation. So this is just pure beeswax, and you can see that the egg is white in color against a yellow background. So you got to get real close to be able to see that sometimes. What I would recommend for you as individuals that are getting started in beekeeping is, if you're using plastic foundation like what's on the right, use black foundation, because you can see just from these two pictures how much that egg pops on that black foundation. Again, you need to be able to see this when you're doing inspections, because you're not going to always find your queen, and you have to know she's there and she's doing her job. So those are what eggs look like. Larva of bees, and this is looking down in those cells. You can see the sun's coming in there just perfectly, but those C-shaped worm caterpillar-like looking things, those are our larvae. You can also see in this picture, if we look at some of this spot down here, this is a smaller larva. So they go through stages. As they grow, they will go through what we call instars. And there's 5 instars in the larval stage. And those are stages that they kind of get bigger. And so what you can see here is this little one right here. And then you got these big beefy ones up here. That's different instar stages. The other thing I want you to note is that when you look down in here, you can also see that milky substance down there. That's their food. You always want to see a lot of that down in the bottom of these cells, because your bees are feeding, your nurse bees are feeding these young. And that is what that pool is down there, is their food. If there's very little down there, it means your bees are starving. All right, cap brood. So this is when we're in that pupal stage. So you don't see any of this happening because it's underneath the caps, but essentially the result is they get bees that chew their way out. You got a couple here on this picture right here. The first responsibility of a bee after it comes out is to clean its cell. So that's the full kind of what's going on in the colony as far as the life cycle is concerned, from egg, larval, and pupal stages, what you'll see. I really like this animation. I gotta admit, I don't remember where this came from. I've had it for a decade, I think. But it is a really nice animation. And the reason that I really like it is because, mostly because of the front end, it's because of the back end. And it shows kind of what the roles of bees change, or how the divisional labor is over time. So when you come out of your cell, your first responsibility is to clean up your cell. The next few days you're going to spend as a nurse bee, and then you're going to hit that wax producing phase that we talked about right after that. So you go from cleaner to nurse bee to wax builder, and then your next responsibility as you start to get older is as a guard bee, and then the very last thing you do as a honeybee is a forager. It's the riskiest activity because you're leaving the colony, and so they save that for the older bees so that the rest of the colony, all the younger bees, are able to continue to proliferate and continue to be replicating the species across the landscape. So the foragers are always your oldest bees coming out of the hive. All right, so the last thing we're going to wrap up with here is bee vision. Bees have trichromatic vision, just like us. So they see most of the visual spectrum that we see, but there's a little difference between the two. So the top one is the human visual spectrum. And you can see that, you know, our visual spectrum is really kind of all of the main colors that we're used to seeing, right? Blue, greens, reds. That is what our vision is primarily comprised of. And we bleed over, you know, and you get into kind of these this area of the visual spectrum where we're kind of like almost to the infrared area. When we're talking about bees, they can see the same kind of central visual spectrum that we can, but they have a lot of ability to see ultraviolet light. This helps them with being able to locate where the sun is on cloudy days, but it also allows them to interpret the landscape a little bit differently. And so I want to just show you an example of what bees see and what we see. So these are asters that we're looking at here. This is human vision right here. What you can see, though, is when we look through the lens of a bee, is that these flowers start to look like targets in the landscape. And so their vision allows them to very easily pick out flowers in a landscape in a way that's a little different than how we can interpret it. But essentially we have, you know, kind of this, I wouldn't say it's the same vision, but it's, you know, we perceive a lot of the same colors except for that ultraviolet spectrum that bees are better at seeing. All right, in summary, understanding the biology of the individual is key in a factor to your success. You need to understand the biology of the organism in order to really understand what you're doing and how to make good decisions in managing your bees. So like I said, memorize some of this. Next line, memorize those life cycles. You're going to have to recall them in the field. And what I mean by that is that if you're in the field and you see a capped queen cell, you need to be able to recall the life cycle of that queen so that you understand that you have less than a week before that hatches and you have another queen and a potential swarm. So those are like what I mean by you need to know these life cycles, because they are going to come up in your beekeeping activity. If you see a queen cell that's open and you consider that life cycle, it gives you information to understand how to manage that colony. So you need to know those. The roles of the workers can change over time with the needs of the colony and can change based on environmental conditions and what's going on as far as resources coming into the colony. The roles of your glands can change over time and in many cases are related to caste and also environmental conditions like resources coming in. And then finally, the visible spectrum of bees is wide. It allows them to perceive most of the colors we do, but like I said, there's that ultraviolet component that allows them to interpret the landscape in a little bit of a different way, and in particular, allow them to be able to see the sun even when we are in situations of cloudy conditions. And that's key because they use the sun to be able to locate where they are in the landscape and how they can get back to their colony. All right, folks, with that, I'll say thank you, and we'll see you at the next lecture.